August 25, 2021. It was a Wednesday evening, just after 6:30 p.m., inside one of the biggest mansions in Fairfield, Connecticut. The Montgomery family sat down for dinner, their long oak table covered with fine china and silver that sparkled under the chandelier. From the outside, it looked like a perfect picture of wealth and comfort. Inside, though, one moment was about to shake the house in a way no one expected. At the table sat Ethan Montgomery, the only son, 25 years old, used to getting what he wanted, and never hearing the word no. He leaned back in his chair, smirking, as if the whole world revolved around him. His parents, distracted and tired, barely looked up as the meal began. Standing quietly nearby was Angela, the maid. She had worked for the Montgomery family for years. At 37, she was careful, steady, and respectful, the kind of person who noticed everything but rarely spoke out. She carried the weight of her own struggles, but here in this house, her role was simple: serve, clean, and stay invisible. That night, Ethan decided to make her the target of a joke. His words were sharp, meant to draw laughs, meant to remind everyone at the table who held the power. For a moment, it seemed like the usual routine. Angela would stay silent, swallow her pride, and the family would move on. But something was different. Angela stopped. She turned. And in a calm voice that carried more strength than anyone expected, she spoke back. What happened in that moment would not only leave Ethan stunned, it would send shockwaves through the entire Montgomery household. The clock in the dining room read 6:47 p.m. The Montgomerys' forks scraped softly against porcelain plates as Angela poured water into crystal glasses. Ethan leaned back, twirling a silver spoon between his fingers. His eyes locked on Angela, and a smirk spread across his face. "You missed a spot," he said loudly, pointing to an invisible stain on the table. His mother, Patricia, gave a half-smile, not even checking, while his father, Charles, simply kept eating. It was a game Ethan had played many times before, picking at Angela, making her presence feel smaller than it already was. Angela adjusted the pitcher in her hand, giving a polite nod. She had learned to let comments slide, to turn hurt into silence, because speaking up usually made things worse. But Ethan wasn't finished. He leaned forward, tapping the spoon against his glass to get attention. "Tell me, Angela," he said, his voice smooth but cutting, "what's it like cleaning up after people who actually matter? Do you ever get tired of being invisible?" His words hung heavy in the air. Patricia shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Charles cleared his throat, but he didn't step in either. For years, this had been Ethan's way, testing limits, showing off power he didn't earn, and using Angela as his favorite target. He wanted a laugh, an audience, and he didn't care who paid the price. He raised his glass in mock celebration, looking directly at her. "You should be grateful, you know. Without us, you'd probably be scrubbing diner floors for loose change." The chandelier light caught Angela's face, revealing the flush in her cheeks. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from something deeper building inside her. Ethan expected her to bow her head and walk away, just as she had countless times before. Instead, she set the pitcher down carefully, almost too calmly, and looked him straight in the eye. For the first time at that table, the room felt unsettled, not because of Ethan's cruelty, but because of what Angela might say next. Angela's hand rested on the edge of the polished oak table, her knuckles pale from the grip. The soft ticking of the grandfather clock filled the silence that Ethan had left hanging. Her eyes met his, not with anger, not even with fear, but with a calmness that unsettled him more than any sharp reply ever could. She drew in a steady breath, her voice even but carrying weight. "With all due respect, Ethan," she said, "my work has value. I may clean floors, but that doesn't make me less of a person. And if you think being invisible is who I am, you've misunderstood everything." The room stilled. Charles set his fork down slowly, his eyes lifting toward her with surprise. Patricia's glass froze halfway to her lips, her composure wavering for the first time that evening. And Ethan, smirk gone, shifted back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to being challenged, not here, not in his own home, and certainly not by Angela. Angela's words didn't come out as a burst of defiance. They were measured, careful, and grounded in dignity. "I show up every day," she continued, her gaze steady. "I work hard, not because I have to prove something to you, but because it's how I was raised, to treat every task with respect. That's more than what money can buy." Her voice didn't waver, and that quiet strength hit harder than shouting ever could. Ethan scoffed, but his laugh cracked under the pressure of the moment. His mother's eyes cut toward him, not with approval this time, but with something closer to shame. Charles leaned back, watching, measuring his son's silence against the courage that had just been displayed by the maid they'd all overlooked for years. The chandelier's light flickered slightly as the storm outside rattled the windows, almost as if the house itself had paused to witness what just unfolded. Angela didn't lower her gaze, didn't retreat into the background where Ethan expected her to remain. She had drawn a line, subtle, firm, undeniable, and in that stillness, the balance of power in the Montgomery household shifted ever so slightly. For a long stretch, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft rattle of rain against the tall windows, as though the storm outside had leaned in to listen. Ethan's smugness had vanished, replaced with a flushed face and a clenched jaw. He glanced toward his parents, almost expecting them to scold Angela, to put her back in the place he thought she belonged. But that correction never came. Charles Montgomery, a man known for his commanding presence at business meetings and family gatherings alike, adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward. His eyes lingered on Angela, sharp but thoughtful, as though he had just noticed her for the first time. He tapped the table once, a small but deliberate gesture, before settling back into his chair. Patricia, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably. Her carefully composed face betrayed a flicker of unease, caught between loyalty to her son and the undeniable truth in Angela's words. The younger siblings, who often followed Ethan's lead, exchanged quiet glances across the table. For them, this was new, watching someone from the staff stand tall in a house where their voices usually carried no weight. Their silence wasn't just surprise, it was a mixture of admiration and uncertainty, as if they weren't sure whether they were witnessing defiance or courage. Ethan broke first, slamming his palm lightly against the table. "So what? You think a speech makes you equal? This is still my family's house. You're still here to serve." His tone carried heat, but even as the words left his mouth, the weight of them fell flat. The authority he once assumed was his alone seemed smaller now, as though Angela's calmness had stripped away the strength behind his outburst. Charles's gaze shifted to his son, cold and deliberate. "Enough." His voice wasn't raised, yet it carried more force than Ethan's shouting ever could. The word lingered in the air, commanding silence. For the first time in years, Ethan leaned back, chastened not by the maid he mocked but by the father who had finally set a boundary. Patricia looked down at her plate, her fingers tightening around the silverware as if holding on to some last thread of control. Yet even she did not defend her son. Angela stood quietly, not triumphant, not smirking, but steady. Her words had been spoken, her dignity intact, and in the hush that followed, the entire Montgomery family seemed to reckon with something uncomfortable. They had underestimated her. The storm outside rolled with another low thunder, and in the stillness of that dining room, a new understanding began to settle, one that neither money nor power could erase. The air inside the dining room felt heavier than the storm outside, every breath measured, every glance carrying unspoken weight. Ethan, still restless in his chair, shifted as though ready to reclaim the ground he had lost. But his father's sharp look kept him tethered, silenced by a force he rarely bowed to. For once, it wasn't his voice filling the room, it was Angela's quiet presence that lingered. Charles leaned forward, folding his hands on the polished mahogany table. His tone was calm, almost deliberate, when he spoke. "Angela," he said, her name carrying a weight it had never been given at this table before. "You've worked here long enough to know this family better than most. Tonight, you've shown more honesty than I've heard in this room in years." His eyes shifted briefly toward his son, then back to her. "And honesty is something we need more of." Those words landed differently. For the staff standing near the doorway, it was as if a curtain had been pulled back on a stage they'd never been invited to stand upon. For Patricia, it was unsettling. She straightened in her chair, her lips pressed tight, unwilling to challenge her husband but clearly uncomfortable with the direction of his words. Angela stood still, unsure if his recognition was an opening or a test. She wasn't used to being addressed this way, not as an employee, but as someone whose voice mattered. "I only spoke the truth," she said softly, her voice steady but respectful. "Respect goes both ways, sir." The silence that followed was thicker than before. Ethan's jaw tightened, and his fists curled under the table, but he said nothing. For the first time, his power in the room was fading. The attention wasn't on his arrogance, but on Angela's unshaken composure. Charles slowly nodded, almost as though confirming something for himself. "Respect does go both ways," he repeated, and there was no mistaking the subtle shift happening in that moment. The balance of the household, the hierarchy that had been unquestioned for years, was tilting in a direction no one expected. The storm outside cracked with a flash of lightning, throwing shadows across the faces gathered at the table. Every person in that room knew, without saying a word, that something had changed forever. Angela had crossed an invisible line, and instead of punishment, she had drawn out something rare: acknowledgement. What none of them realized yet was that this moment would set off a chain of events neither wealth nor tradition could contain. The morning after the storm, the mansion felt different. The usual clatter of dishes and muted conversations among staff were replaced by hushed tones and sideways glances. What had unfolded the night before was more than just a dinner gone wrong, it was a moment no one could stop thinking about. Angela, who usually blended into the background, was suddenly at the center of whispered conversations. Some of the staff admired her courage, others feared for her job, but all of them knew something had shifted. Charles's words echoed in the halls: "Respect goes both ways." For years, those who worked under his roof rarely heard such things spoken aloud. It was as if Angela had opened a door that could no longer be shut. The staff carried themselves a little differently that day, moving with quiet assurance, watching carefully for signs of what might come next. Inside the family quarters, the tension hadn't eased. Patricia moved through the morning with her usual elegance, but her expression betrayed unease. She had spent her married life keeping order, keeping appearances, and last night's exchange had shaken her control. The thought of a maid standing tall before her son was more than unsettling, it was embarrassing. She avoided Angela entirely, her silence saying more than words ever could. Ethan, on the other hand, burned with humiliation. In his eyes, Angela's defiance wasn't bravery, it was an insult he couldn't forget. He stayed out of sight most of the day, but his anger was felt. In every slammed door, every curt word tossed at anyone who crossed his path. His pride had been cut, and the wound was deep. Yet Charles remained unusually calm. He went about his day with an almost thoughtful air, as though weighing something in his mind. He had seen countless arguments in his home, but none had left him considering the voice of a maid before. More than once, his gaze lingered on Angela as she worked, his silence leaving her unsure whether she had earned his respect or placed herself in danger. By evening, the house seemed suspended in quiet suspense. The staff walked with caution, the family members avoided each other's eyes, and Angela carried out her duties with steady hands, though her heart beat harder than usual. She had stood her ground, but the question remained: what price would follow? The echoes of that stormy dinner hadn't faded. In fact, they were only just beginning to unravel the delicate balance inside the mansion. The family had built their world on wealth and appearances, but Angela's defiance had cracked that surface, and there was no telling what would come spilling out next. It was September 8, 2021, just 2 weeks after that stormy night when everything changed inside the Whitmore estate. The mansion was alive with preparation for a family gathering, relatives arriving from out of town, laughter echoing through the grand halls, and silver polished to perfection. Yet, underneath the celebration, the question still lingered: what would become of Angela? When the clock struck 7 p.m., the family assembled in the grand dining room, joined by a handful of close relatives and staff. Angela, dressed in her usual uniform, moved quietly at the edge of the room, unsure why she had even been asked to stay. Her hands trembled as she held the tray, not out of fear but from the weight of uncertainty. At the head of the table, Charles cleared his throat. The room fell silent. His eyes scanned his family, lingering on his son before settling on Angela. 2 weeks ago, he began slowly, we all witnessed something unusual. We saw a woman who works in this home speak truth when others chose silence. His voice grew stronger. Angela reminded us that respect cannot be bought. It must be earned and given. A stunned hush swept through the room. Angela's breath caught as she lowered the tray to the sideboard, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Charles leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Angela, you did not dishonor this family. In fact, you honored what it should stand for. Tonight, I want everyone here to know, your job is safe. More than that, you have my respect. Gasps whispered across the table. Patricia shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressed tight, but she did not object. Ethan, red-faced and rigid, avoided his father's eyes. The weight of humiliation still clung to him, but in that moment, it was clear, his father's word was final. Angela's eyes stung with tears she fought to hold back. For the first time since she had stepped foot in that house, she felt seen. She bowed her head slightly, not out of submission, but gratitude. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. The staff, watching from the doorways, exchanged glances of quiet triumph. They knew they had witnessed something rare, a shift in power, a reminder that dignity was not tied to wealth. The evening carried on, but something had changed in that mansion forever. Angela returned to her duties, not as invisible help, but as a woman who had stood tall when it mattered most. The Whitmores, with all their wealth and pride, had been forced to confront a truth they could no longer ignore. And in the hearts of everyone who heard the story, whether in whispers through the staff quarters or retold in the town below, it lived as a reminder. Sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the one with power, but the one with the courage to speak. Now, let me ask you, what would you have done if you were in Angela's shoes that night? Would you have stayed silent, or spoken up, knowing what it might cost? Share your thoughts, because stories like this remind us that courage can come from the most unexpected places. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this.